On the sun-drenched island forgotten by time, a boy of 12 hammers weathered planks into place on what was once a mighty galleon. His only companion, a scrappy terrier mix, watches attentively from the deck. The abandoned child works tirelessly, his small hands calloused beyond their years, restoring piece by piece what the sea had claimed generations ago. Each nail driven is an act of defiance against his solitude, each repaired beam a statement that he belongs somewhere in this world. The rotting hull that once carried notorious pirates now cradles a different treasure, a boy who refuses to surrender to abandonment. Could the faded captain's journal he discovered in the ship's hidden compartment reveal why he feels so strangely at home among these pirate ruins? The small fishing boat disappeared over the horizon 4 years ago, leaving 8-year-old Matteo alone on the shore, a battered rucksack at his feet. Only the scrappy terrier pup had stayed, whimpering and pressing against his leg as the boat grew smaller against the setting sun. His mother had kissed his forehead, pressed something into his palm and whispered words he couldn't understand through her tears. "I'll return when it's safe," she had promised. But the seasons changed, and she never came. Matteo uncurled his fingers now, staring at the worn brass key she had given him. 4 years of clutching it while he slept had left an impression on his palm. He tucked it back into the leather pouch around his neck and patted Rusty's head. "Just you and me still, boy," he said, voice cracking from disuse. Speaking aloud had become a ritual to remember the sound of human voices, even if only his own. The island had been generous enough, fresh water from a central spring, fruit trees heavy with bounty, fish that practically leapt into his makeshift nets. Survival wasn't the challenge. The crushing solitude was. Rusty woofed softly, nudging his hand, reminding him that he wasn't completely alone. Matteo had built a shelter of palm fronds and driftwood on the beach that first year, moving it higher as he learned the rhythm of the tides. By the second year, he had fashioned a more permanent hut against the rock face, safe from storms. He had grown nearly a foot taller, his body lean and brown from sun and work. The storm came without warning in his 3rd year on the island. 3 days of howling winds and lashing rain that tore his hut to splinters and drove him and Rusty into a narrow cave. When they emerged, the beach was transformed. The storm had carved away a massive section of sand, revealing dark, weathered timbers beneath. Curious, Matteo had dug with his hands until he uncovered what appeared to be the curved hull of a ship, not some small fishing vessel, but something massive buried for decades, perhaps centuries. Over the following weeks he excavated carefully, revealing more of the structure. A ship entombed in sand and coral, preserved by the very elements that had claimed it. One morning, after a particularly productive dig, his hand broke through into a hollow space. Widening the hole, he lowered himself into what must have been a cabin. The air was stale but remarkably dry. Rusty barked from above, unwilling to follow. "It's all right," Matteo called up, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. His eyes adjusted to the gloom, revealing a room with collapsed furniture, a table still bolted to the floor, a shattered chair, shelves hanging at odd angles. And there, partially protected by a fallen beam, lay a leather-bound book. Matteo approached cautiously, as if the book might dissolve at his touch. The leather was cracked but intact, the pages yellowed but legible. Opening it revealed handwritten entries, a captain's log. Though his mother had taught him basic reading, many words were unfamiliar or faded beyond recognition. But dates were clear. The final entry from 1873, nearly 150 years ago. He carefully tucked the journal into his shirt and explored further. The cabin held other treasures. A brass compass missing its needle, a corroded tin of what might have been tobacco, and a small chest that refused to open despite his efforts. That night, sleeping in his hastily rebuilt shelter, Matteo read what he could of the journal by firelight. The writer, Captain Santiago Vélez, commanded a vessel called the Reckoning. Many passages described navigation, weather, and ports of call. Others, more intriguing, referenced a cargo of great consequence, and powers that would claim what is rightfully ours. One passage caught his attention. The bloodline must continue. The legacy must endure. When the time comes, the heir will return to reclaim what was lost. Something about those words resonated in Matteo's chest. He traced a birthmark on his shoulder, a curious pattern his mother had called his special sign, and wondered why the captain's flowing script seemed vaguely familiar. The next day, Matteo made a decision. The buried ship would become his new home, his project, his purpose. He would restore what time and sea had claimed. He began collecting tools. His first a hammer fashioned from driftwood and a stone, later improved with metal scavenged from the ship itself. Each day he worked from sunrise to sunset, clearing sand, reinforcing timbers, patching holes. Rusty would sit watching, occasionally bringing him gifts of driftwood as if understanding the grand project. At night, by firelight, he would study the captain's journal, gradually making more sense of the entries as his reading improved through practice and determination. In the quietest hours, when even Rusty slept, Matteo would whisper to the stars, "I'm still here. If you're looking for me, I'm still here." Whether the message was for his mother or someone else, he couldn't say. 4 years of solitude had taught Matteo patience. Each sunrise brought the same routine. Check fishing lines set the previous evening, gather fresh fruit, maintain his increasingly complex water collection system, and work on the ship. The vessel had become his obsession, his sanctuary, his hope. Rusty had grown into a sturdy companion, more vigilant and intelligent than any dog Matteo had known in his previous life. The terrier would scout the island each morning, returning with small game or interesting finds, shells, oddly shaped pieces of driftwood, once even a glass bottle with a faded label. "What would I do without you, boy?" Matteo often asked, scratching behind Rusty's ears. The dog would wag his tail furiously, as if understanding the depth of their bond. The ship revealed its secrets slowly. As Matteo cleared more sand and cut away strangling coral, he uncovered the true magnitude of his project. The galleon was nearly 90 feet long, with a broad deck and multiple levels below. Much of the wood had rotted away, but the sturdy oak frame remained largely intact, preserved by the very sand that had entombed it. Matteo had converted the captain's quarters into his living space, reinforcing the ceiling and walls, creating a dry, secure room where he kept his few possessions. The captain's journal occupied a place of honor on a shelf he had fashioned from driftwood. One morning, while attempting to clear a particularly stubborn section of coral from what appeared to be a storage compartment, Matteo's makeshift pry bar broke through the weathered wood. Reaching carefully into the opening, his fingers closed around something cold and metallic. He pulled out a brass spyglass, tarnished but complete. That evening, he polished the instrument with sand and cloth until it gleamed in the firelight. The focusing mechanism was stiff but functional. Extending the spyglass, he marveled at how clearly it brought distant objects into view. The next day, he climbed to the highest point on the island, Rusty trailing behind. From this vantage, the ocean stretched endlessly in all directions. Raising the spyglass to his eye, he scanned the horizon methodically, heart quickening at a distant speck. "A ship, Rusty! A ship!" he shouted, voice hoarse with excitement. He scrambled down the hillside, gathering dried palm fronds and driftwood into a large pile. With trembling hands, he struck flint to steel, creating a spark that caught the tinder. Soon a robust fire blazed, sending a column of smoke into the clear sky. For hours, Matteo paced the beach, waving a makeshift flag fashioned from his spare shirt tied to a long branch. The distant vessel continued on its course, never deviating, never acknowledging his desperate signals. As the ship disappeared over the horizon, Matteo sank to his knees in the sand. Rusty whined, pressing against him in silent comfort. That night, for the first time in years, he wept openly, the weight of his isolation crushing down upon his shoulders. Morning brought renewed determination. If ships passed too far to see his signals, he would create something impossible to miss. The buried galleon would become his salvation, not just a home, but a beacon. He sketched plans in the sand, envisioning how the restored ship would look when completed, no longer partially submerged, but proudly sitting on the beach, masts reaching skyward, visible for miles. "We need better tools," he told Rusty, who tilted his head attentively, "and more materials than just what we can scavenge." Over the following weeks, Matteo systematically explored every inch of the island, collecting anything useful: vines strong enough for rope, tree sap that hardened into a serviceable resin, stones suitable for hammers and chisels. He established a daily routine: mornings for gathering food and materials, afternoons for working on the ship, evenings for studying the captain's journal and planning the next day's labor. 2 more ships passed during this time, both too distant to notice his fires. After each disappointment, Matteo would return to the ship with renewed vigor, working until his muscles screamed and his hands bled. "One day they'll see us," he promised Rusty, who would wag his tail encouragingly. The spyglass became his most treasured possession after the journal. Each morning and evening, he would scan the horizon, hope never completely abandoned. But increasingly, his focus turned inward, to the ship itself, to creating not just a signal for rescue, but a home worthy of pride. In his 12th year, 4 years after beginning his restoration project, Matteo had managed to clear most of the sand from around the ship's hull and reinforce large sections of the deck. Though still partially submerged at high tide, the galleon was taking shape, transforming from a rotting wreck into something that hinted at its former glory. The sky darkened ominously, transforming from brilliant blue to angry charcoal in a matter of hours. Matteo had witnessed many storms during his years on the island, but something about this one raised the hair on his arms. The air felt charged, electric. "Come on, Rusty," he called, gathering his tools from where he'd been working on the ship's port side. "We need to secure everything." The wind picked up rapidly, bending palm trees into painful arches and sending loose sand stinging against his skin. Matteo hurried to the captain's quarters, now his makeshift home, and began reinforcing the entry with additional planking. Rusty paced anxiously, whining at the growing thunder. "It'll pass," Matteo assured him, though uncertainty crept into his voice. By nightfall, the storm had escalated beyond anything in Matteo's experience. Rain came horizontally, driven by winds that howled like tortured spirits. The ship creaked and groaned around them, timbers protesting against the assault. Most concerning was the rising water. The tide pushed by the storm was higher than normal, threatening to flood the lower portions of the ship that Matteo had worked so hard to clear. "We need to move higher," he shouted over the cacophony, gathering the captain's journal and his few precious possessions into a waterproof pouch made from sealed palm leaves. They climbed to the upper deck, seeking shelter behind the remnants of the ship's wheelhouse. Water surged around the hull, waves breaking over the deck. A particularly violent gust tore away a section of railing Matteo had recently repaired, carrying it into the darkness. Around midnight, the worst happened. A massive wave crashed over the starboard side, sweeping across the deck with terrifying force. Matteo barely had time to grab Rusty and clutch a secured beam before the water hit them. The torrent nearly tore them away, but Matteo's grip held. The pouch containing his possessions wasn't so fortunate, torn from his belt and carried overboard. No. Matteo screamed, watching years of collected treasures disappear into the churning water. Without thinking, he secured Rusty to the beam with a length of rope and dove into the surging sea. The salt water stung his eyes as he searched frantically in the near-total darkness, guided only by intermittent lightning flashes. His lungs burned for air, but determination drove him deeper. His hand brushed something. Not his pouch, but a jagged edge of metal protruding from the sand beneath the ship. Forced to surface for air, Matteo gasped and oriented himself. The ship was barely visible through the rain. He dove again, following the contour of the hull underwater. The metal edge he'd felt seemed to be part of a compartment or chest embedded in the sand under the ship's belly. Another desperate need for air pulled him upward. This time, miraculously, he spotted his pouch caught in exposed rigging near the ship. Fighting the current, he managed to grab it before being slammed against the hull. Pain exploded in his shoulder, but he clutched his prize tightly. With the last of his strength, Matteo pulled himself back onto the deck, untied Rusty, and retreated to the relative safety of the wheelhouse. There they huddled, soaked and shivering, until dawn revealed the storm's aftermath. Sunlight exposed both destruction and opportunity. Large sections of sand had been washed away from around and beneath the ship, revealing previously hidden portions of the hull. The damage to Matteo's repairs was substantial, but the storm had done work that would have taken him months. After ensuring Rusty had food and water, Matteo investigated the metal edge he'd discovered underwater. The receding tide left it exposed, a small strongbox partially embedded in the sand. Using his makeshift tools, he carefully excavated around it, eventually freeing the barnacle-encrusted container. The lock had long since corroded, allowing him to pry open the lid. Inside, protected by a watertight seal, lay several items: a rusted pistol, documents too water-damaged to decipher, and something that made Matteo's breath catch: a gold doubloon. The coin was heavy in his palm, its surface etched with unfamiliar markings. One side showed a compass rose, the other an intricate symbol that triggered a flash of recognition. Hurrying to retrieve the captain's journal, Matteo flipped through the pages until he found what he sought: the same symbol, sketched in the margin beside an entry he hadn't been able to fully translate. He held the coin next to the drawing. The match was perfect. "Rusty," he whispered, excitement replacing his exhaustion. "I think we've found something important." The dog tilted his head curiously as Matteo continued examining the coin. Tiny inscriptions ran around its edge, words in a language he didn't recognize, except for one phrase that appeared to be a date: 1762. In that moment, standing amid storm debris with the golden proof of history in his hand, Matteo made a decision. He would no longer merely repair the ship as shelter or signal. He would restore it completely, uncover its secrets, and perhaps discover why he felt such a profound connection to this vessel and its long-dead captain. Restoration became Matteo's singular focus. Each morning he surveyed his progress, planning the day's work with growing expertise. The storm had revealed the true extent of the galleon, nearly 100 feet of weathered grandeur, far larger than he initially believed. The challenge of moving heavy timbers alone seemed insurmountable at first. Through trial and error, Matteo developed an ingenious system of levers and counterweights, using the island's natural features to his advantage. Bomb trunks became rollers. Vines reinforced with fibrous strands served as rope. Stones carefully shaped into tools extended his reach and strength. "We need to be smarter, not stronger," he explained to Rusty, who watched attentively as Matteo sketched plans in the sand. The dog had become an unexpected assistant, dragging smaller pieces of driftwood from the shoreline and alerting Matteo to potential dangers. The coin had become Matteo's talisman, worn on a cord around his neck alongside his mother's brass key. At night, he studied the strange markings, comparing them to sketches in the captain's journal. Though many pages remained indecipherable, he began recognizing patterns in the captain's handwriting, piecing together fragments of the ship's story. One entry mentioned secret compartments known only to the true Veles, bloodline. Another described a hidden map visible only to those who share our legacy. The references to bloodlines and legacy appeared repeatedly, often accompanied by the same symbol found on the coin. The work was exhausting but rewarding. Each repaired plank, each secured beam brought the ship closer to its former glory. Matteo developed calluses on top of calluses, his adolescent frame hardening with muscle. His knowledge grew alongside his strength, learning which wood could withstand salt water, how to seal joints against the elements, the optimal angle for drainage on the deck. One sweltering afternoon, While reinforcing the forward section, Matteo's foot broke through a weathered plank. As he carefully widened the hole to replace the damaged wood, Rusty began barking excitedly, pawing at the opening. "What is it, boy?" Matteo knelt beside the dog, peering into the darkness below. Rusty continued barking, his entire body vibrating with excitement. Matteo fashioned a torch from resin-soaked wood and lowered it through the opening. The light revealed a small space between the outer hull and an interior wall, a narrow passage that shouldn't exist according to the ship's apparent design. Widening the hole enough to slip through, Matteo lowered himself into the hidden compartment. The space was tight but navigable, extending forward toward the bow. He crawled carefully, mindful of weakened timbers. The torch held before him. The passage ended at a small chamber beneath what would have been the forecastle. Years of sand and sediment had filled the lower portion, but the upper half remained relatively intact. There, half buried in hardened sand, Matteo spotted something metallic. He excavated carefully, gradually revealing a large bronze bell. Though tarnished and pitted with age, its shape was unmistakable. With considerable effort, he freed it from its sandy prison and examined his find. The bell was surprisingly heavy, its surface encrusted with marine growth and oxidation. Returning to his living quarters, Matteo spent hours carefully cleaning it with sand, vinegar made from fermented fruit, and fresh water, gradually revealing the metal beneath the accumulation of time. As the last of the crust fell away, an inscription became visible around the bell's base, "The Reckoning, 1762, followed by the same symbol found on the coin and in the journal. "The Reckoning," Matteo whispered, running his fingers over the engraved name. Finally, he could properly address the ship that had become his home and purpose. That evening, he read through the captain's journal with renewed interest, scanning specifically for mentions of the ship's name. He found several entries that took on new meaning. "The Reckoning sails at dawn. Our cargo secured below special hold. When the Reckoning returns to these waters, may it be under better stars than those that guide us now. I fear the Reckoning may be our legacy and our doom in equal measure." Most intriguing was an entry that mentioned a birthmark. "The true heir will bear the mark of navigation upon their flesh, as have all Velez captains since time immemorial." Matteo's hand unconsciously moved to his right shoulder, where a strangely shaped birthmark had always drawn comments. His mother had called it his compass star, for its resemblance to a nautical rose. For the first time, he wondered if her words held deeper meaning. The following day, Matteo mounted the restored bell at the bow of the ship. When struck, it rang out across the water with surprising clarity, its voice unchanged by centuries of silence. The sound filled him with inexplicable pride, as if awakening something long dormant in his blood. He had named his home at last. Now the Reckoning would rise again. The solitude weighed heaviest at dusk. As daylight faded, Matteo would often pause his work to watch the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues that no one else would see. In these quiet moments, the magnitude of his isolation pressed upon him like a physical weight. "We're doing well, aren't we, Rusty?" he would ask, scratching behind the dog's ears. Rusty's tail would thump against the weathered deck, his canine optimism unwavering. The work on the Reckoning progressed steadily, but remained daunting for a single pair of hands. Matteo had managed to rebuild large sections of the main deck and reinforce the captain's quarters into a proper living space. Still, entire portions of the hull required attention, and the masts existed only in his imagination and sketches. One morning, while Matteo worked on securing a particularly troublesome section of decking, disaster struck. Rusty, chasing after a seabird that had landed nearby, bounded across a portion of deck that appeared solid but wasn't. The weathered wood gave way with a sickening crack, and Rusty disappeared into the opening with a yelp of surprise and pain. "Rusty!" Matteo scrambled to the hull, heart pounding. Below, he could see the dog lying motionless on the lower deck, a fall of nearly 12 feet. "Rusty boy, please be okay." The terrier's side rose and fell with shallow breaths, but he didn't respond to Matteo's voice. Moving with careful urgency, Matteo found the hatch leading below and rushed to his friend's side. Rusty whimpered when touched, his back leg bent at an unnatural angle. For 3 days, Matteo barely left Rusty's side, fashioning a splint for the broken leg and carrying the dog to and from his makeshift bed. He crushed painkillers made from island plants his mother had once shown him, mixing them with Rusty's food. The thought of losing his only companion terrified him more than any storm or hunger ever had. "You have to get better," he whispered into Rusty's fur at night. "I can't do this alone." On the 4th day, Rusty attempted to stand, putting tentative weight on his splintered leg. Matteo wept with relief when the dog managed a few hobbling steps. Though recovery would take time, the immediate danger had passed. The accident forced Matteo to be more methodical in his restoration efforts, testing each section thoroughly before proceeding. Progress slowed but became more reliable. While Rusty recuperated, Matteo focused on smaller projects, including exploring more of the recently exposed sand around the ship's bow. During one such excavation, his shovel struck something solid. Careful digging revealed a carved wooden figure emerging from the sand, a woman's form, arms extended as if embracing the sea. The figurehead, once proudly mounted on the ship's bow, had broken off and been buried alongside the hull. The carving was remarkably intact, protected by the same sand that had preserved much of the ship. The woman's face was serene, yet strong, eyes gazing eternally forward, hair flowing behind her in wooden waves. Something about her expression reminded Matteo of his mother, the same determined set to the jaw, the same watchful eyes. With considerable effort, he freed the figurehead completely and brought it aboard. For days, he worked to restore it, carefully removing sand and growth, treating the wood with oils made from island plants to prevent further deterioration. As he worked, he found himself talking to the wooden woman as if she could hear. "The reckoning is coming back to life," he told her. "You'll be back where you belong soon." When Rusty had recovered enough to move around more freely, Matteo undertook the challenging task of reattaching the figurehead to the bow. Using a complex system of ropes and pulleys, he managed to hoist the heavy carving into position and secure it with newly crafted brackets. Standing back in his canoe to observe his work, Matteo felt a surge of pride. The figurehead transformed the vessel from merely a ship to a guardian with a soul. That night, he sat before the wooden woman in the moonlight. "I wish you could tell me about him, Captain Velez," he said softly. "Was he a good man? Why do I feel like I know him somehow?" In the silence that followed, Matteo imagined what she might say if she could speak. He gave her a voice in his mind, wise and gentle, telling him tales of brave voyages and distant shores. It became a nightly ritual, sitting with the figurehead he now called Madre del Mar, Mother of the Sea, sharing the events of his day and asking questions about the past. "My mother said she'd come back when it was safe," he confided one evening. "Do you think she will?" The wooden face remained impassive, but in the patterns of moonlight and shadow, Matteo sometimes imagined expressions changing, responding to his words. Rusty would often sit beside him during these one-sided conversations, head tilted as if he too were listening to replies only Matteo could hear. These talks filled a void in Matteo's heart, providing comfort and breaking the silence that sometimes threatened to consume him. The figurehead became more than decoration. She was confidant, teacher, and surrogate mother to a boy forced to grow up alone on the edge of the world. A full year had passed since Matteo discovered the gold doubloon. The reckoning's transformation was remarkable. No longer a rotting skeleton, but a vessel taking shape, rising from its sandy grave. Nearly half the main deck had been completely restored. The captain's quarters were fully functional as Matteo's living space, and the figurehead gazed proudly from her perch at the bow. Matteo himself had changed as much as the ship. Now 13, he had grown several inches taller, his body lean and muscled from constant physical labor. His skills had evolved from crude necessity to something approaching craftsmanship. With tools salvaged and created over the years, he could now shape wood with precision, splice rope with expert fingers, and solve complex structural problems with ingenious solutions. Rusty had recovered fully from his accident, though he moved with a slight limp when tired. The dog had become more cautious on the ship, as if remembering his fall, but remained Matteo's loyal shadow throughout each day's work. The captain's quarters had become a repository for Matteo's most valuable finds. The journal occupied a place of honor on a shelf he'd constructed, alongside the spyglass and several other artifacts recovered from within the ship. His latest project involved restoring a large sea chest found buried deep in the hold. The chest had been sealed tight, its lock corroded but intact. Breaking it open revealed a trove of navigation equipment. A brass sextant, several compasses, a set of charts preserved in oilcloth, and a cylindrical case containing drawing instruments. Though tarnished with age, most items remained functional or could be restored with careful attention. The charts fascinated Matteo most of all. Unfolding them carefully, he discovered maps of coastlines, both familiar and strange, dotted with annotations in the same flowing script as the captain's journal. Stars were marked in patterns he recognized from his nights under the open sky, with calculations and notations alongside. This is how they found their way. "Rusty," he explained, spreading the charts across his table. The dog sniffed curiously at the aged parchment before settling nearby. Though his mother had taught him basic reading and numbers, navigation was beyond Matteo's knowledge. Still, the charts awoke a hunger to learn. Each evening he studied them by lamplight, comparing the stars on paper to those visible through his cabin window, gradually deciphering the system of lines and measurements that guided sailors across trackless oceans. Using the sextant required practice. At first, Matteo could barely hold the instrument steady, much less take accurate readings. But persistence paid off, and within weeks he could determine his position with increasing precision. The island appeared on none of the charts, but by triangulating known coastlines and landmarks, he estimated its location in what the maps labeled as Spanish waters. These new skills expanded Matteo's world beyond the physical confines of his island. As he plotted theoretical courses on the charts, he imagined sailing the reckoning to distant ports, Panama, Jamaica, Cartagena. For the first time since his abandonment, escape seemed theoretically possible, not merely a desperate wish. One night, while studying a particularly detailed chart of the Caribbean, Matteo noticed faint markings different from the navigational notations. Following them with his finger, he realized they formed a pattern similar to the symbol on his coin and the ship's bell. When he held the chart up to his oil lamp, additional marks became visible, lines and notations previously invisible in normal light. "Secret ink," he whispered, remembering stories his mother had told of messages hidden from prying eyes, only revealed by heat or certain light. Excited by this discovery, Matteo carefully examined the other charts by lamplight. Several contained similar hidden markings, forming what appeared to be an alternative route through dangerous waters, pointing to locations not marked on the public-facing maps. The most intriguing discovery came when examining a small chart of what appeared to be his very island. While the coastline matched what he knew, the interior contained markings he didn't recognize, symbols like those in the journal, arranged in patterns around a central point marked with the now familiar compass rose symbol. When Matteo placed his coin directly on this symbol, the markings seemed to radiate from it like spokes from a wheel. Something about the arrangement stirred his memory. The pattern matched his birthmark almost exactly. That night, standing at the ship's rail under a blanket of stars, Matteo felt a growing certainty that his presence on this island was no accident. The coin, the charts, the journal entries about bloodlines and legacies, his own mysterious birthmark, they formed a constellation of connections too perfect to be coincidental. "There's something here, Rusty," he said, his voice steady with newfound purpose. "Something meant for me to find." The dog wagged his tail as Matteo gazed toward the island's interior, where the hidden chart had marked its mysterious center. Tomorrow, he decided, he would follow where the map led. But tonight he had stars to study and courses to plot. For the first time, the future held more promise than his past. The hull of the Reckoning extended deeper beneath the sand than Matteo had initially realized. During exceptionally low tides, portions of the lower hull became accessible, revealing the true magnitude of the ship. These rare opportunities allowed him to explore sections normally hidden beneath water and sand. During one such low tide, Matteo noticed an unusual coral formation clinging to the hull near the keel. Unlike the typical growths that covered much of the submerged wood, this formation appeared almost intentional, forming a distinct pattern around a specific area. "Look at this." "Rusty," he called to the dog who stood at the water's edge, reluctant to join Matteo in the shallows. "It's almost like it's protecting something." Curious, Matteo began carefully removing the coral, revealing wooden planking beneath that appeared different from the surrounding hull, newer or perhaps better preserved. As he cleared more coral, he uncovered what appeared to be a small hatch, sealed by time and marine growth. Breaking through required several days of careful work during subsequent low tides. Matteo fashioned a breathing tube from hollow reeds, allowing him to work underwater for longer periods. Finally, the hatch gave way, revealing a small chamber within the hull. Inside, wedged against what appeared to be a support beam, sat a wooden chest. Unlike the captain's sea chest, this one was heavily reinforced with metal bands, now corroded and weakened by centuries underwater. The chest had been partially crushed by shifting timbers, but remained largely intact. Extracting it proved challenging. The chest was wedged tightly, and Matteo feared damaging both it and the ship by forcing it free. Eventually, he devised a system using the tides themselves, attaching flotation devices fashioned from sealed gourds that would gradually lift the chest when the tide rose. His patience was rewarded when the chest finally broke free, floating to the surface where he could secure it with rope. Dragging it ashore, Matteo examined his find with excitement tempered by caution. The chest was surprisingly heavy, despite its damaged condition. Opening it required breaking the corroded lock with his tools. Inside, Matteo discovered several waterlogged books, their pages fused together into solid masses. Various navigational instruments too damaged to salvage, and most importantly, a metal tube. Sealed with wax and apparently watertight, inside the tube, Matteo found a roll of oilcloth containing a logbook different from the captain's journal. The handwriting was sharper, less flowing than Captain Velez's script. The first page identified it as the account of Joaquin Mendez, first mate of the Reckoning, 1762. That night, by lamplight, Matteo pored over the first mate's log. Though many entries mirrored the captain's journal in recording position, weather, and daily events, the tone differed dramatically. Where Captain Velez wrote with authority and sometimes poetic flourish, First Mate Mendez's entries were terse, often critical, and occasionally openly hostile. "Captain continues his obsession with the map and medallion," one entry read. "The crew grows restless with these diversions from our charted course. Good men whisper of bad luck and worse leadership," another entry dated several weeks later. "Third time this month the captain has locked himself in his quarters with that damned chest of his. Whatever treasure he seeks comes at the cost of this ship's true purpose." Some begin to question his fitness for command. Most intriguing were references to conflict over the ship's final destination. "Captain insists we make for the uncharted island, despite my objections. Our hold carries cargo for Havana worth a king's ransom, yet he would risk all for some mystical legacy he claims awaits us. The map he guards so jealously shows nothing but open water and certain death." The most troubling entry came near the log's end. "7 men approached me tonight. They speak of taking matters into their own hands if the captain continues this foolhardy course. I neither encouraged nor dissuaded them. May God forgive my silence, for it speaks louder than words. The final pages contained frantic entries describing a worsening situation. Storm comes upon us swift and merciless. Captain claims providence guides us even as waves threaten to swallow us whole. The men who planned to move against him now pray alongside those who remained loyal. Death makes brothers of enemies. The very last entry was incomplete, the writing jagged as if done in haste. Land sighted, but too late. Ship taking on water faster than we can pump. Captain orders all hands to... The rest remained unwritten. Matteo sat back, his mind racing. The first mate's account painted a very different picture of the reckoning's final voyage than the captain's confident entries. It spoke of mutiny brewing, of divided loyalties, of a captain potentially driven by obsession rather than duty. "There are always two sides to every story," Matteo told Rusty, who lay at his feet. "But which one is true?" He placed the first mate's log alongside the captain's journal on his shelf, the two accounts facing each other like adversaries frozen in time. The conflicting narratives added new dimensions to the reckoning's story, and perhaps to Matteo's own connection to the ship. The storm arrived without warning, transforming the placid morning sea into a churning cauldron by midday. Unlike the devastating tempest that had uncovered the gold doubloon, this storm seemed more intent on delivery than destruction. Matteo and Rusty watched from the relative safety of the captain's quarters as waves drove debris toward the shore. The flotsam began arriving shortly after the storm's peak. Splintered wood, torn canvas, shattered crates. Matteo recognized the grim signature of a shipwreck, likely recent and nearby. When the worst had passed, he ventured to the beach to salvage what he could. Among the debris, a large trunk caught his attention, its brass fittings glinting despite the gloom. Unlike the weathered artifacts of the reckoning, this trunk was modern, its wood still bright beneath the saltwater stains. Matteo approached cautiously, painfully aware of what shipwrecks often meant, not just lost cargo, but lost lives. The trunk's lock had broken on impact, allowing Matteo to open it easily. Inside lay women's clothing, neatly packed, but now sodden with seawater. Practical items filled the interior pockets, a sewing kit, a small mirror, a hairbrush with a few dark strands still caught in the bristles. Personal possessions meant for a journey never completed. As Matteo carefully removed the items to dry them, something small and metallic fell from between folded garments. A locket, silver and intricately engraved, landed on the sand. The chain had broken, but the locket itself remained intact, its surface tarnished but undamaged. With gentle fingers, Matteo pried open the locket. Inside, protected from the seawater, was a small portrait of a woman. Her dark eyes gazed directly at the viewer, her expression both stern and somehow tender. Beside the portrait, secured under a small glass panel, was a lock of dark hair tied with thread. Matteo's hands began to tremble. The woman's features, the high cheekbones, the slight asymmetry of her eyes, the curve of her jaw, were hauntingly familiar. They mirrored his own face, but even more strikingly, they resembled his memories of his mother. "It can't be," he whispered, sinking to his knees in the wet sand. He stared at the portrait for what felt like hours, trying to convince himself it was merely coincidence, the desperate projection of a lonely boy. But the resemblance was undeniable. This woman, whoever she was, shared blood with him, perhaps his grandmother or a great-aunt, or some other relation he had never known. Returning to the reckoning with the locket and the most salvageable items from the trunk, Matteo found himself in a state of numb confusion. He had spent years believing his abandonment was random cruelty or desperate necessity. Now evidence suggested something more deliberate, more connected to this place and this ship than he had dared imagine. He placed the locket beside the captain's journal and first mate's log. 3 pieces of a puzzle he was only beginning to understand. The rest of the day passed in distracted attempts at work, his mind constantly returning to the woman's portrait. That night, Matteo couldn't sleep. He sat at his makeshift desk, the locket open before him, the captain's journal in his hands. Flipping through pages he had read dozens of times. He searched for any mention of women associated with the crew or Captain Velez specifically. Near the back of the journal, on pages he had previously dismissed as too water-damaged to decipher, Matteo noticed something he had overlooked. Holding the page at an angle to the lamplight revealed the impression of writing pressed into the paper from a now missing page. With careful shading using charcoal dust, he gradually made the impressions visible. Isabella carries my child. I have sworn to return before the birth, but fate may dictate otherwise. If I do not survive this voyage, may this journal find its way to my son or daughter. The legacy of the Velez line must continue for reasons beyond mere family pride. What we protect must never fall into imperial hands. Matteo read the words repeatedly, his heart pounding. Captain Santiago Velez had been expecting a child, his child, when the reckoning made its final voyage. A child who would carry the Velez bloodline. With trembling fingers, Matteo opened the locket again. The woman, could she be Isabella? But that was impossible. The locket was modern, not an artifact from the 1700s, and yet the resemblance to his mother was unmistakable. A wild theory began forming in Matteo's mind. What if the Velez bloodline had continued? What if his mother had known about their connection to this place, to the reckoning? What if his abandonment had not been abandonment at all, but a return, a bringing home? She knew, Matteo whispered to Rusty, who watched him with concerned eyes. Somehow, she knew about all of this. For the first time in years, the memory of his mother's final words returned with crystal clarity. I'll return when it's safe. Remember who you are, Matteo Velez. Velez. His own last name, barely remembered after years of disuse, suddenly took on profound significance. He wasn't just a castaway surviving by chance. He was Matteo Velez, restoring his ancestors' ship, perhaps fulfilling some destiny set in motion. Centuries before his birth, the revelation of his family name, Velez, ignited an almost frantic energy in Matteo. Areas of the ship he had, deemed less important, suddenly became critical to explore. If his connection to the reckoning was more than coincidental, perhaps the ship itself held answers about his family, his past, and why his mother had left him here. A section of the lower deck had remained largely unexplored, partly due to frequent flooding, and partly because its collapsed beams made access difficult. Now Matteo attacked the obstacles with renewed determination, shoring up compromised structures and creating a narrow passage through the debris. Rusty followed cautiously, whining occasionally as if sensing his master's agitation. The air grew staler as they penetrated deeper into the ship's belly. Matteo's torch cast jumping shadows across rotted timbers and glistening hull planks. There must be something here, he muttered, pushing forward despite the cramped conditions. The passage ended at a small door, swollen with moisture but still intact. Unlike the ornate captain's quarters, this entrance was functional, utilitarian. A small brass plate, tarnished almost beyond recognition, adorned its center. Matteo scraped away years of corrosion with his knife, gradually revealing an inscription, records. The door refused to yield to normal pressure. Using a makeshift pry bar, Matteo worked methodically around the frame, careful not to damage what might lie within. Finally, with a groan of protesting wood, the door swung partially open, releasing a waft of stagnant air. Matteo squeezed through the narrow opening into what appeared to be a record-keeping room. Shelves lined the walls. Many collapsed, their contents spilled across the tilted floor. Waterlogged books and scrolls had fused into unrecognizable masses in the lower areas, but the higher shelves, protected from the worst flooding, still held intact documents. Working by torchlight, Matteo examined the room's contents. Most papers meant little to him. Cargo manifestos, expense accounts, crew rosters from voyages long concluded. Then on a higher shelf, he discovered a leather portfolio secured with a cord, its contents protected from the elements. Inside lay the ship's official documents, letters of marque, authorizing Captain Velez to intercept enemy vessels on behalf of the Spanish crown, ownership papers bearing the royal seal, and most significantly, a complete passenger and crew manifest for the Reckoning's final voyage. The manifest listed 72 souls aboard, 46 crew members including officers, 17 passengers listed as Spanish citizens returning to Madrid, and 9 individuals identified only by initials. At the very bottom, added in a different hand from the rest of the document, was a notation that made Mateo's breath catch. Child, male, surname Velez, 3 years of age. A child. A Velez child had been aboard during the final voyage. Mateo sat heavily on a fallen beam, the manifest trembling in his hands. Was this child his ancestor? Had he survived the shipwreck somehow, continuing the Velez line that eventually led to Mateo himself? Or had the child perished with the others, leaving Captain Velez's unborn child with Isabella to continue the family name? Further examination of the portfolio revealed a folded document sealed with wax. The seal had cracked with age, allowing Mateo to open it without damage. Inside was a letter, written in the same flowing script as the captain's journal, but more formal in tone. To whom it may concern, I, Santiago Velez, captain of the Reckoning, hereby acknowledge and claim paternity of the child Miguel Velez, born to Constanza Diaz on the 15th of March, 1759. It is my wish that said child be recognized as my legal heir in all matters pertaining to my estate and holdings, should fate prevent me from making more formal arrangements upon my return to Spain. The letter continued with legal language about inheritance rights, but Mateo could hardly focus on the words. Miguel Velez, a recognized son of the captain, a 3-year-old boy aboard the Reckoning during its final voyage. What had happened to this child during the shipwreck? Had he somehow survived? Mateo's mind raced with possibilities. If Miguel had lived, he could indeed be Mateo's ancestor, connecting him directly to Captain Velez across the centuries. If the boy had perished, then perhaps Mateo descended from the captain's unborn child with Isabella mentioned in the journal. Either way, the evidence was mounting. Mateo Velez was not on this island by accident. His mother had known, must have known, about this connection. She had brought him home, to the place where his family story had experienced its most dramatic turning point. As Mateo carefully gathered the documents to take back to his quarters, a small notation at the bottom of the manifest caught his eye. Next to the entry for the Velez child was a symbol, the same compass rose that appeared on the coin, the bell, and in the journal. The symbol that matched his birthmark. It's real, he whispered to Rusty, who watched him with patient eyes. All of it. They belong here. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture both beautiful and terrible in its implications. His mother hadn't abandoned him to a cruel fate. She had returned him to his legacy, perhaps at great personal cost. The question that remained, the question that burned in his mind as he made his way back through the ship's dark passages, was why. 2 years passed in a blur of purpose and progress. The Reckoning, once a forgotten skeleton, now stood proudly on the beach, 70% restored to its former glory. At high tide, the ship actually floated, though it remained tethered to shore by heavy ropes. Mateo, now 15, had become as much shipwright as castaway, his hands skilled and sure where once they had fumbled. What do you think, Rusty? Will she sail one day? He asked, scratching behind the aging dog's ears. Rusty, grey around the muzzle but still spry, wagged his tail in apparent agreement. The figurehead, Madre del Mar, gleamed with fresh oils, her wooden expression serene as she gazed out to sea. Mateo had taken to carving small improvements into her features, adding detail and expression that may or may not have been part of the original design. Inside, the Reckoning had transformed from mere shelter to proper home. The captain's quarters housed Mateo's growing collection of artifacts and documents. The galley, partially restored, allowed for proper cooking when weather permitted a controlled fire. He had even managed to rebuild one of the ship's boats, a small dinghy that enabled him to fish in deeper waters and explore nearby coves. Yet for all this progress, questions about his connection to the ship continued to haunt Matteo. The documents from the record room confirmed his lineage, but offered few clues about why his mother had left him here, or promised to return when safe. Safe from what? From whom? On a particularly hot afternoon, as Matteo worked to replace a section of railing near the bow, he noticed something odd about the figurehead's base. The wood there seemed different, newer than the surrounding material, as if it had been replaced at some point before the ship's final voyage. "What secrets are you hiding now?" he murmured, running his fingers along the seam where the newer wood met the original. Tapping the area produced a distinctly hollow sound. After confirming the structural integrity wouldn't be compromised, Matteo carefully chiseled along the seam, eventually revealing a small hidden compartment within the base of the figurehead. Inside lay a single item, a key ornate and heavy, its design featuring a skull worked into the handle. Unlike the weathered brass key his mother had given him, this one was silver, its surface darkened but untarnished, protected from the elements within its wooden vault. The skull's empty eyes seemed to watch him as he turned the key in the fading light. "Another piece of the puzzle," he told Rusty, who sniffed the key with interest before losing enthusiasm. That evening, Matteo examined the key more closely in his quarters. Its craftsmanship was exceptional, the skull rendered in surprising detail, with tiny symbols etched into the metal around the eye sockets, symbols matching those in the captain's journal and on the charts. But what did it open? Matteo had explored most of the reckoning by now, finding many locked compartments and containers, but none with keyholes matching this ornate key's unusual design. The answer came to him while dreaming. In his sleep, Matteo saw Captain Velez, a figure he'd imagined countless times from journal descriptions, standing before a hidden panel in the captain's quarters, inserting a skull key into an invisible lock. The panel swung open to reveal. Matteo woke with a start, the dream still vivid. Dawn light filtered through the cabin window as he jumped from his bed and began examining the wall panel where the dream captain had stood. The wood appeared uniform, without obvious seams or hinges, but when Matteo ran his fingers along the edges, he felt a slight depression, a small indentation nearly invisible to the eye, heart racing. He pressed the key against the depression. It didn't fit. Turning the key over, he tried the opposite end, where the skull's teeth protruded slightly. This time, the teeth aligned perfectly with the indentation. With a deep breath, Matteo pushed the key into the wall and turned it. A soft click rewarded his effort, and a section of paneling, perhaps 2 feet square, swung inward on hidden hinges. Behind it lay a small compartment containing a metal box, untouched by time in its sealed hiding place. The box opened without a key, its simple latch still functioning smoothly. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, Matteo found several items. A small leather pouch containing gemstones that caught the morning light in brilliant colors, a ring bearing the Velez family crest, a miniature portrait of a stern-faced man who could only be Captain Santiago Velez himself, and most importantly, a folder containing documents written in the captain's distinctive hand. Unlike the logbook's matter-of-fact accounts, these papers revealed the true purpose of the Reckoning's final voyage, not a simple trading mission, but something far more significant. The documents detailed an elaborate plan to hide a treasure from those who would claim it without right, specifically naming Spanish authorities who had apparently betrayed the captain in some complex political intrigue. Most critically, a map laid out the location of the main treasure cache, not aboard the Reckoning at all, but hidden somewhere on the very island where the ship had met its end. The map featured landmarks Matteo recognized, the distinctive twin peaks at the island's center, the crescent bay where he had first been left, the unusual rock formation he called the Sentinel for its resemblance to a standing figure. At the map's center, marked with the now familiar compass rose symbol, was a location Matteo had never explored, a cave system in the island's interior, accessible only through a narrow ravine that local currents made dangerous to approach by water. Preparing for the expedition consumed Matteo's next week. The cave system lay 3 miles inland, through dense jungle and rocky terrain. According to the captain's map, the entrance was concealed behind a waterfall in a narrow ravine, difficult to spot unless one knew exactly where to look. Matteo crafted torches from resinous wood, wrapped in cloth and soaked in oil rendered from fish. He fashioned a sturdier pack from sailcloth, reinforced with leather salvaged from an old sea chest. Into this went dried fish, fruit, water skins, the map, and his tools. A coil of rope, carefully tested for strength, hung at his belt. "You'll have to stay aboard, old friend," Matteo told Rusty on the morning of departure. The dog whined in protest, pressing against his leg. "The terrain's too rough for you now," Rusty barked once firmly, his expression as stubborn as Matteo had ever seen it. "Fine," Matteo conceded with a smile. "But I'll carry you if the going gets too difficult." They set out at dawn, following the map's carefully drawn route. The island, though relatively small, presented challenging terrain, steep inclines, dense vegetation, occasional swampy areas where brackish water pooled in the rainy season. Matteo used his machete to clear a path where necessary, marking trees to guide his return journey. By midday, they reached the foot of the Twin Peaks. Here the map indicated a fork in the path, one leading directly between the mountains, the other circling around the base of the eastern peak. The direct route was shorter but steeper, the circular path longer but gentler. Mindful of Rusty's age, Matteo chose the latter. The decision proved wise. Even the gentler path demanded careful climbing in places, with loose rock that shifted underfoot. Twice, Matteo carried Rusty across particularly difficult sections, the dog patient in his arms, despite his earlier insistence on coming along. Late afternoon brought them to a ridge overlooking a narrow gorge. Far below, a stream cut through the rock, feeding into a small pool before continuing toward the sea. According to the map, the waterfall and cave entrance lay just beyond a sharp bend in the gorge, hidden from casual view. "We'll make camp here," Matteo decided, finding a flat area sheltered by overhanging rock. Better to tackle the descent with fresh legs tomorrow. That night, seated beside a small fire, Matteo reviewed the documents from the hidden compartment by firelight. Beyond the map itself, Captain Velez had left detailed instructions for navigating the cave system. Warnings about unstable passages, underwater sections that required breath-holding, chambers where the ceiling might collapse if disturbed. Most intriguing were the captain's notes about the treasure itself. Not mere gold and gems, though these are plentiful enough. The true prize lies in what they protect, knowledge that would shift the balance of power if fallen into imperial hands. The Velez legacy is not wealth but wardenship. Matteo pondered these cryptic words as the fire burned low. What knowledge could be so valuable that it required such elaborate protection? And how did it connect to his mother's promise to return when safe? Sleep came fitfully, his dreams filled with dark passages and whispered warnings. He woke before dawn, alert and eager to continue despite his interrupted rest. After a light breakfast of dried fruit, they began their descent into the gorge. The path down was treacherous, steep, slippery with moss and poorly defined. In places, Matteo had to backtrack and find alternative routes. Rusty followed gamely at first, but eventually accepted being carried in Matteo's pack, his head poking out to observe their progress. By mid-morning, they reached the gorge floor. The roar of the waterfall, hidden around the bend, echoed off stone walls that towered hundreds of feet above them. Following the stream, Matteo rounded the corner and caught his first glimpse of their destination. The waterfall cascaded nearly 50 feet from an opening in the cliff face, feeding the clear pool below. Rainbows danced in the mist where sunlight penetrated the gorge. Behind the falling water, barely visible, was a dark recess that had to be the cave entrance. Approaching the pool, Matteo noticed ancient carvings in the surrounding rocks, stylized waves, stars, and the now familiar compass rose symbol. The markings confirmed they were in the right place, following in Captain Velez's centuries-old footsteps. The cave entrance required passing behind the waterfall itself. Matteo wrapped the map and documents in oilcloth, secured Rusty more firmly in the pack, and took a deep breath. With careful steps, he edged along a narrow ledge behind the falling water, pressed against slick rock, fighting the disorienting effect of the thunderous cascade just inches away. Finally, they emerged into the relative quiet of the cave entrance, a broad chamber with a high ceiling, water streaming in rivulets down its walls to join a small stream that disappeared deeper into the mountain. Ancient torch brackets, now rusted and empty, lined the walls at regular intervals. Matteo lit one of his own torches, its light revealing more carvings on the interior walls, elaborate scenes of ships, storms, and star patterns. Unlike the weathered exterior markings, these were crisp and well-preserved, protected from the elements for centuries. Setting Rusty down to stretch his legs, Matteo consulted the map again. According to Captain Velez's notes, they needed to follow the underground stream deeper into the cave system. The true entrance to the treasure chamber lay nearly a quarter-mile inside the mountain, past several false passages designed to confuse and trap unwelcome visitors. "We're close." "Rusty," Matteo whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the chamber. "After all these years, we're finally close." The dog wagged his tail cautiously, sniffing the damp air with evident unease. Beyond the pool of torchlight, the darkness seemed to watch them, ancient and patient, guarding secrets that had remained hidden for generations. The deeper passages of the cave system, twisted and branched like the veins of some great stone beast. Matteo followed the underground stream, torch held high, consulting the map at each junction. Rusty padded alongside, occasionally whining at strange echoes that reverberated through the darkness. "It's all right," Matteo reassured, though his own heart raced at each new shadow. The torchlight revealed spectacular formations, stalactites that hung like stone daggers, stalagmites rising to meet them, flowstone cascades frozen in eternal descent. According to the map, the main treasure chamber lay beyond a series of 3 challenges. The first appeared after an hour of careful progress, a narrow passage where the stream disappeared beneath the rock, leaving only a shoulder-width crawl space above. "Wait here," Matteo told Rusty, securing his torch in a crack in the wall. The dog settled reluctantly as Matteo removed his pack and pushed it ahead of him into the confined space. The crawl space extended nearly 30 feet, the ceiling occasionally dipping so low that Matteo had to turn his head sideways to continue. Just as claustrophobia threatened to overwhelm him, the passage widened into a chamber large enough to stand in. He pulled his pack through, returned for Rusty and the torch, then continued their journey. The second challenge came in the form of a deep chasm cutting across their path. The underground stream plunged into its depths, creating a small waterfall that disappeared into darkness below. A narrow stone bridge, clearly artificial, constructed from carefully placed slabs, spanned the gap. Matteo tested the bridge cautiously. Though ancient, it appeared solid, each stone fitted precisely against its neighbors without mortar. Still, he crossed with extreme care, carrying Rusty to prevent the dog from slipping between gaps in the stone. Beyond the bridge, the passage widened dramatically into a cathedral-like space. Matteo's torch couldn't penetrate the full height of the ceiling, creating the impression of standing beneath an infinite darkness. The air felt different here, drier, somehow charged with expectation. At the chamber's far end stood a carved doorway, its surface covered with intricate symbols similar to those in the captain's journal. Unlike the natural formations of the cave, this structure was clearly man-made, a portal of dressed stone set into the living rock. The door itself was a masterpiece of ancient craftsmanship, 10 feet tall, made of a dark wood that had somehow resisted rot in the cave's damp environment. Metal bands reinforced its structure, and at its center, embedded in an ornate plate, was a keyhole shaped like a sword. Matteo examined the door carefully, running his fingers over the carvings. There was no handle, no obvious mechanism beyond the sword-shaped keyhole. The map offered no guidance beyond leading them to this point. Now what? He muttered, stepping back to survey the imposing barrier. Rusty, who had been exploring the chamber's perimeter, suddenly barked sharply from a darkened alcove nearby. Following the sound, Matteo directed his torchlight into the recess. There, embedded in stone as if grown from the mountain itself, stood a sword. Not a common sailor's cutlass, but an elegant rapier with a jewel-encrusted hilt that caught the torchlight in flashes of emerald, ruby, and sapphire. The blade, though centuries old, gleamed as if freshly polished. "Impossible," Matteo whispered, approaching the weapon. Like the Arthurian sword in the stone, it appeared to be part of the rock itself, only the hilt and a foot of blade exposed. He touched it hesitantly, half expecting some trap. When nothing happened, he grasped the hilt firmly. To his surprise, the sword moved slightly, as if inviting extraction. With a deep breath, Matteo pulled. The blade slid free with unexpected ease, releasing a sound like a sigh from the stone itself. The perfectly balanced weapon felt alive in his hand, almost humming with potential energy. Intricate engravings ran the length of the blade, and at the base, near the hilt, was the familiar compass rose symbol. This had to be Captain Velez's sword, perhaps the very weapon he wore when commanding the Reckoning. And now Matteo realized it served a final purpose as the key to the treasure chamber. Approaching the wooden door, Matteo aligned the blade with the sword-shaped keyhole. It matched perfectly. With a silent prayer to whatever forces had preserved these secrets for centuries, he pushed the sword into the lock and turned it. A series of metallic clicks echoed through the chamber as ancient mechanisms awakened. Slowly, majestically, the great door swung inward on silent hinges, releasing a waft of air that smelled of spice and metal and time itself. Beyond lay a chamber that stole Matteo's breath, a vast space illuminated by a strange ambient light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Phosphorescent minerals created a soft blue glow that revealed the chamber's contents without need for torch or lantern. The treasure of the Reckoning lay before them in glittering splendor. Gold coins in scattered piles, chests overflowing with gems, silver plates stacked in tarnished towers. Artifacts of obvious antiquity and immense value covered stone tables, statues, jewelry, ornamental weapons. But it was what stood at the center of the chamber that truly captured Matteo's attention. A raised platform supporting a large sea chest, more ornate and imposing than any he had yet discovered. Unlike the scattered wealth surrounding it, this chest sat alone, spotlighted by a shaft of natural light from some unseen opening in the distant ceiling. Matteo stepped forward, drawn to this central mystery. Behind him, Rusty barked a sudden warning, the sound echoing sharply through the treasure chamber. Matteo turned just in time to see shadows moving at the entrance, large, bristling shapes that grunted and snorted as they blocked the only exit. Wild boars, at least 5 of them, filled the chamber entrance, their tusks gleaming in the phosphorescent light. The largest, a scarred behemoth with one broken tusk, pawed the ground aggressively. These were not the smaller forest pigs Matteo occasionally hunted. These were massive beasts that could easily gore a man with one charge. Rusty growled, positioning himself between Matteo and the threat, his aging body tensed for protection rather than flight. The boars responded with angry snorts, the leader taking a threatening step forward. "Easy, boy," Matteo whispered, mind racing. The jeweled sword, still in his hand, seemed suddenly inadequate against such natural weaponry. He glanced around for an alternative escape route, seeing none. The lead boar charged without warning, covering the distance with shocking speed. Matteo swung the sword instinctively, catching the beast across the shoulder. The blade cut true, but the wound only enraged the animal further. It wheeled around for another attack as its companions began to advance. Rusty, the chest! Matteo shouted, backing toward the central platform. If they could gain the higher ground, perhaps they could hold the boars off until finding another exit. They reached the platform just ahead of the charging herd. Rusty scrambled up first, with Matteo close behind, slashing the sword to keep the nearest boar at bay. From this vantage, the situation looked dire. The boars now circled the platform, effectively trapping them. "We need a plan," Matteo muttered, keeping the sword pointed toward their attackers. Rusty barked sharply, drawing Matteo's attention to the sea chest behind them. In their haste to escape, he hadn't examined it closely. Now he noticed a peculiar lock mechanism, not a keyhole, but a circular indentation that looked oddly familiar. With a jolt of recognition, Matteo reached for the gold doubloon hanging around his neck. The coin that had started his quest so long ago. Could it be the final key? Keeping one eye on the circling boars, Matteo pressed the coin into the indentation. It fit perfectly, and with a click that echoed through the chamber, the chest unlocked. The boars, startled by the sound, backed away momentarily. Matteo lifted the chest's heavy lid. Inside lay not gold or gems, but a metal cylinder similar to the one that had preserved the first mate's log, though larger and more ornately decorated. Beside it rested a folded oilskin package, secured with the Velez family seal. The largest boar recovered from its surprise and rammed the platform, nearly toppling Matteo. The entire structure shook ominously. It wouldn't hold for long against such determined assault. With no time to examine his finds properly, Matteo stuffed the oilskin package into his shirt and grabbed the metal cylinder. He needed a distraction, something to clear a path to the exit. His gaze fell on a rack of ancient weapons along the chamber's far wall, and beyond them, barely visible in the dim light, what appeared to be a narrow crevice. "Perhaps another way out? We need to make a run for it," he told Rusty, who responded with a tense whine. Matteo's eyes darted around the chamber, seeking anything useful. A pile of oil-soaked torches sat near the platform's edge, presumably left by previous visitors. Inspiration struck. Fire. Wild animals feared fire. When the boat anchored in the shallows, the older of the two men called out in Spanish, "Hello, the ship. Permission to come ashore?" "Granted," Matteo replied in the same language, surprised at how rusty his voice sounded with so little use. The younger man and boy remained with the boat while the elder waded to shore. He was tall and lean, deeply tanned with weather-creased eyes that suggested a lifetime at sea. Nothing in his manner suggested threat, just open curiosity. "Remarkable," the fisherman said, gazing up at the reckoning. "When we saw a galleon from a distance, I thought my eyes played tricks. Never expected to find anyone living here, much less a fully restored ship." "I'm Miguel Ortiz from Santa Clara Island, Matteo Velez," he responded, the family name still feeling new on his tongue. "This is my home." Something flickered in Miguel's eyes at the name, recognition, perhaps even respect. Velez? The ship's original name was lost to history, but local legends speak of Captain Velez and his mysterious final voyage. Matteo tensed slightly. "What legends?" Miguel shrugged. "That he discovered something the Spanish crown wanted badly. That he disappeared with his ship and treasure rather than surrender it. Old stories passed among sailors." His gaze sharpened. "But finding a Velez here with this ship, perhaps not just stories after all." A moment of silence stretched between them before Miguel continued. "We fish these waters seasonally. Never came this close to the island before. Currents make it dangerous most times. But today the water was calm, and we saw your signal." Matteo relaxed slightly. The encounter seemed genuinely coincidental, not some targeted search for the Velez legacy. After brief consideration, he made a decision. "Would you and your companions like to come aboard? I have fresh fruit to share, and it's been a very long time since I had visitors." The fisherman accepted gratefully. Young Carlos, Miguel's grandson, stared wide-eyed at the reckoning as they climbed aboard. Rusty greeted them with cautious sniffs that turned to friendly tail wags when Carlos offered gentle scratches. Over a simple meal, Matteo learned more about the outside world than he had known in years. The nearest inhabited island lay 3 days' sail away. A small community of fishermen and their families lived there, largely self-sufficient and removed from mainland politics. Miguel spoke of markets where fish and handcrafts were traded for necessities that couldn't be produced locally. "You could come with us when we leave," Miguel offered. A young man shouldn't live alone. The invitation was genuine and tempting. Yet as Matteo looked around at the reckoning, at the home he had built, the legacy he protected, he felt no desire to abandon it. "Thank you, but this is where I belong," he said finally. "However, I would welcome visitors, perhaps trading partners." A glint of interest appeared in Miguel's eyes. "What would you have to trade?" Matteo considered carefully before answering. "Fresh fruits that don't grow on your island. Medicinal plants. And I'm good with repairs, ships, tools, anything really." Miguel nodded appreciatively. "Valuable skills. We could certainly bring supplies you might need, metal tools, cloth, perhaps books." The mention of books sent a thrill through Matteo. Reading material beyond the captain's journal and navigational documents would be treasure indeed. By day's end, an arrangement was struck. The fishermen would return in 1 month, bringing agreed-upon items to trade. Miguel even suggested that other trusted families might visit occasionally, establishing a small but regular connection with the outside world. As the fishing boat departed, silhouetted against the setting sun, Matteo felt something shift within him. He had chosen to remain on the island not from necessity, but from purpose. The reckoning was not his prison, but his heritage, not his isolation, but his strength. That night, he sat on the quarterdeck beneath a canopy of stars, Rusty sleeping peacefully beside him. For the first time since childhood, he allowed himself to imagine a future beyond mere survival, a life with occasional visitors, with purpose, perhaps someday even with answers about his mother's fate. From the scrap sailcloth left from his signal construction, Matteo began crafting a new flag. Upon it, he painted the Velez family crest as depicted on the captain's ring, adding his own interpretation of the compass rose that marked his birthmark. When finished, he would fly it proudly from the reckoning's mainmast, not a distress signal, but a declaration. He was no longer waiting to be rescued. He was home. 5 years passed in a rhythm of seasons and tides. The reckoning, now fully restored, stood as a landmark visible for miles offshore. What had begun as occasional visits from Miguel's fishing boat expanded into regular trading exchanges with trusted families from nearby islands. Matteo, now 20, had grown into a man respected by the small network of islanders who knew of his existence. His knowledge of shipbuilding, navigation, and natural medicine made him a valuable trading partner. In exchange for his expertise and the island's unique resources, he received books, tools, news of the wider world, and occasionally, companionship. The captain's quarters had transformed into a proper library, with shelves of carefully maintained volumes ranging from practical manuals to literature and history. Through these books and conversations with visitors, Matteo educated himself far beyond what formal schooling might have provided. Rusty had passed peacefully 2 years earlier, falling asleep in his favorite spot on the quarterdeck and simply not waking. Matteo had buried him on a bluff overlooking the sea, marking the grave with a carved wooden headstone that read simply, "My first friend." The loss had been profound, but time had softened its edge. Life aboard the Reckoning was no longer solitary. A pair of Rusty's puppies, born to a visiting fisherman's dog, had claimed the ship as their territory. Mischievous and loyal, they filled the silence with playful energy that reminded Matteo of their father in his younger days. More significantly, the Reckoning had gradually become something beyond a home. It was evolving into a haven. On 3 occasions, Miguel had brought people in need of sanctuary, a young woman fleeing an abusive situation, an elderly scholar whose political writings had made him unwelcome on his home island. and a teenage boy orphaned by a storm. Each had stayed for a time, the woman for 3 months until arrangements were made for her safe passage to the mainland. The scholar for nearly a year until his death from natural causes. The boy for 6 months before being adopted by a childless couple in Miguel's community. These temporary residents had changed something fundamental about the reckoning's purpose. Captain Velez had hidden his ship and treasure from imperial authorities. Now his descendant was using that legacy to protect others in need. Mateo began keeping a visitor's logbook, recording each arrival and departure with the same careful precision that Captain Velez had maintained in his journal. The parallels were not lost on him, one captain documenting a journey of discovery, another recording the creation of a different kind of destination. The island itself had been transformed as well. What began as Mateo's simple survival garden had expanded into cultivated areas throughout the accessible terrain. Fruit trees, medicinal plants, and vegetables thrived under his care, providing abundance that supported both permanent and temporary residents. With Miguel's help, Mateo had constructed small outbuildings near the reckoning, a workshop for repairs, a smokehouse for preserving fish, a guest cabin for visitors who preferred solid ground to the ship's gentle rocking. A wooden dock extended into the bay, allowing easier access for trading vessels. Though technically alone much of the time, Mateo no longer experienced the crushing isolation of his early years. Regular visitors, scheduled trading days, and occasional longer-term guests provided human connection without compromising the special nature of the haven he had created. On rare occasions, Miguel would bring news that might relate to Mateo's mother. Reports of a woman matching her description, asking questions about remote islands in various ports. Rumors of authorities still searching for descendants of certain seafaring families with historical claims against the government. Nothing concrete, but enough to maintain a fragile hope that she was alive and perhaps still seeking a way to return safely. The Velez legacy had evolved beyond mere custodianship of hidden knowledge. While Mateo still protected the navigational secrets and historical documents, he had added his own chapters to the family story. The principles remained the same, providing sanctuary from oppressive powers, maintaining independence, valuing knowledge over mere wealth, but the application had broadened. One crisp autumn morning, as Mateo supervised the unloading of trade goods from a visiting boat, Miguel took him aside with unusual seriousness. "There's a man asking questions in Santa Clara," the old fisherman said quietly. "About a restored galleon on an uncharted island, about a young man named Velez." Mateo tensed. "Enemy or friend?" "Impossible to say. He's well-dressed, educated. Claims to be a historian researching lost Spanish ships." Miguel shrugged. "Could be genuine. Could be someone looking for what your ancestors hid." Mateo nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for the warning. What will you do?" Mateo gazed at the reckoning, at the community gathering on its deck, at the legacy he had built from abandonment and isolation. What Captain Velez would have done. Prepare, observe, protect what matters, but not hide in fear. Miguel clasped his shoulder approvingly. "You've created something special here, Mateo, something worth protecting." Indeed he had. The reckoning was no longer just a ship or even just a home. It had become a symbol of resilience, a gathering place for those who valued freedom and knowledge, a living testament to what one determined spirit could accomplish against seemingly impossible odds. Whatever came next, whether threat or opportunity, danger or reunion, Mateo would face it not as an abandoned child, but as the captain of his own destiny. Dawn painted the horizon in gentle strokes of gold and rose as Mateo stood on the forecastle of the reckoning. The early morning air carried the scent of salt and possibility, a familiar perfume that never lost its power to center him. Behind him, the ship stirred with quiet activity. 3 families had sought temporary refuge aboard following a devastating hurricane that had swept through nearby islands. Children slept in hammocks strung between masts, While adults had begun preparing breakfast in the communal galley Matteo had established on the main deck, he watched a fishing boat approach from the east. Miguel's grandson Carlos, now a capable captain in his own right, arriving with fresh supplies and perhaps news of the mysterious historian who had been asking questions. 12 years had passed since Matteo had been left on this shore as a child. The island that once seemed a prison had become the foundation of something remarkable, a legend whispered among coastal communities, a safe harbor for those in need, a repository of knowledge, both ancient and newly created. The reckoning itself had evolved beyond even Matteo's ambitious restoration plans. While maintaining its historical integrity, he had incorporated practical improvements, rain catchment systems, small vegetable gardens in repurposed lifeboats, even a rudimentary signaling system using polished metal mirrors that could communicate with friendly vessels miles offshore. Carlos secured his boat to the dock and climbed aboard, with the ease of long familiarity. At 18, he had grown into a thoughtful young man who shared Matteo's passion for maritime history. "The historian has left Santa Clara," he reported without preamble. "Departed on a government vessel 3 days ago." Matteo nodded, absorbing this information. "Government vessel? Not a private research ship?" "Naval auxiliary, according to my father. Small but well-armed." Carlos hesitated. "There's something else." Before leaving, he showed some of the elders a portrait. A woman he claimed was his research partner, who had disappeared years ago while investigating the Vélez legend. Matteo's heart constricted. Did anyone recognize her? No one admitted it to him. Carlos met Matteo's gaze directly. "But my grandfather says the portrait strongly resembled how you've described your mother." The possibility hung between them like a tangible thing. Hope and danger intertwined. If the man sought Matteo's mother, was he ally or adversary? Was she alive, a prisoner, or something else entirely? "What would you do?" Carlos asked quietly. Matteo turned to survey the reckoning in its morning glory, the polished bell catching first light, the family crest flag fluttering proudly, the evidence of lives being lived and protected upon its decks. Everything he had built from abandonment and loss. "I'll do what Vélez captains have always done," he answered. "Stand my ground and protect what matters." Later that morning, after helping distribute supplies among the refugee families, Matteo climbed to his private sanctuary, a small platform he had constructed at the very top of the mainmast. From this vantage, he could see the entire island and miles of surrounding ocean. He removed the captain's hat he now wore as a symbol of his role, letting the breeze cool his thoughts. The metal compass he carried everywhere rested in his palm, its needle swinging faithfully north. Constant, despite the uncertainties surrounding him. Whatever came, reunion, confrontation, or continued vigilance, he was prepared. The abandoned child had found purpose greater than mere survival. The legacy that began with Captain Santiago Vélez centuries earlier continued not just in preserved documents and hidden treasure, but in the living example of the reckoning itself, a sanctuary born from shipwreck, a community created from isolation. Matteo replaced the hat and tucked the compass into his pocket. Below, Carlos organized a fishing expedition with some of the older children, while women tended the gardens and men repaired storm damage to one of the outbuildings. The scene reflected everything the reckoning had become, not just a ship, but a symbol of resilience and renewal. As he began his descent to rejoin the community, Matteo paused midway down the mast. On the far horizon, barely visible against the morning haze, a sail had appeared. Too distant to identify, it nonetheless moved with purpose, maintaining a course that would bring it directly to the island. Friend or foe, past returning or future approaching, the vessel would arrive by sunset. Matteo felt a curious calm settle over him. The reckoning had weathered storms, both literal and figurative. Whatever this new arrival might bring, the ship and its captain stood ready. The circle that began with abandonment had transformed into belonging. The journey that started with a boy hammering weathered planks had culminated in a man who had built not just a vessel, but a legacy. Captain Mateo Velez adjusted his hat, squared his shoulders, and climbed down to prepare his people for whatever might come with the changing tide.